what we normally do is open the meeting. Introductions, we'll just start if you say who you are and your interest in here, such as I'm Dave White and I'm the chairman of the Federal Lakes Committee and a voter. And we'll try to speed that up so we will get through it. We'll start with you, ma'am. Okay.
I'm Joyce Smith, and I live in Detroit, and I'm concerned about the water. Detroit resident.
Dave Shively, U.S. Power Squadron, and concerned voter.
Brad Nanke, Salem City Councilor, Chair of the North Santiam Watershed Council.
Chris Goetz, City of Salem Drinking Water.
Lacey Gorse Priest, City of Salem Drinking Water and Lyons resident.
Dave Joseph, Detroit.
Lynn Schultz, Detroit Water Level.
Debbie Roll, Detroit resident and city councilor.
Sharon Bonnet, Detroit resident, concerned about the lake.
And Terry Bonnet from Detroit.
Jane Dalglish, Army Corps of Engineers. Rebecca McCown, North Santiam Watershed Council Coordinator.
Gary Vaughn, Mayor Gates.
Cara Diglin, Detroit, concerned about the water.
Doug Bigland, Detroit property owner. Detroit Lake. Greg Ellison, pastor of Detroit Community Church and Idana Community Church.
Rita Ellison, pastor's wife, voter, concerned citizen.
Been Taylor, Detroit, 60 years.
Martha Taylor, Detroit resident.
Rhoda Jensen, Detroit resident.
Jeff Chipman, 6-month resident.
Kylie Shipman, concerned voter.
Emma Montar, concerned voter.
Keith Owen, concerned recreation liaison.
Greg and Kara Pilcher, Stillwater Recreation.
Jeremy Gator, ditto as well. Brandon Hilliard, concerned business owner. Craig Reese, concerned voter.
Color. Marble Order.
Roger Cannon, voter, concerned about the canyon. Scott Riley, grandfather was voting grandkid. Are you the last row?
Lucas Lunsky, Detroit Marina Manager. Chris and Kim Story, Detroit homeowner.
Greg Donald Benson, concerned voter.
That's the last guy. We'll start here and then go around and then we'll start with the people seated. Please go, sir.
Good morning, Detroit resident.
Gene Smith, Detroit resident. Bob Odell, voter.
Mike Lyons, camper voter since '87 on Detroit Lake, concerned about levels.
Gene Martin, voter.
Melissa Martin, voter.
Elizabeth Smith, homeowner.
Todd Smith, homeowner and voter.
Mark Feynman, Kelly Feynman, Sublimity resident, Detroit Lake, property owner, concerned citizen, mortgage investor.
Amy Flores, concerned citizen.
Sam Murphy, property owner, Lake Lover. Scott Brentano, concerned voter.
Shelley Eagle, Detroit homeowner.
Gordon Masterson, resident advisor, homes in Detroit. Craig Diver, business owner, Detroit.
Monty and Joanne Runkle, property owner, who are on a boat there, voters.
Jim Jungman, concerned voter.
Glenn and Julian McClatchy, property owners, concerned voter.
Bart, where's the cards? Let's get them passed out.
Greg Porter, voter.
Danielle Gonzalez, Mary County and North Alabama.
Jim Hay, Gates, owner and concerned voter.
David and Kim Wolf, voter and recreational.
Kate, Detroit homeowner and concerned voter.
Matt Davis, homeowner and games customer.
Jeff Miller, North Santiam Sportsman's Club board member.
Chris, 25-year member of North Santiam Sportsman's Club, voter, recreational, and mortgage voter.
Chris Fry,
Chris Ryan, North Santiam Sportsman's Club, Dr. Chairman.
Vanessa Rebel, case Marion County.
Jim Gilbert, North Santiam Sportsman's Club, board member.
Michelle Mitchell, part-time resident, concerned voter, Detroit.
Sean Britton, part-time resident, concerned voter. Tim and Michelle Butler, concerned voter, and concerned about our water resources and what we call.
Mark Roberts, property owner, recreation user, lover of the Cartwright That's changed.
Ed Flip, Marion County Emergency Manager.
Leah Stevens, concerned voter.
Ariel with the Commodore Greyhound Yacht Club.
Jimmy Brock, concerned voter.
Chris Graham from Senator Wynn's office. Tom Weather, Marshall.
Christina Maple, Morris customer.
All of layman, business owner, homeowner, sure.
Jesse Keeper, David, business owner, homeowner, and related.
Jeff Richards, advocate for students with disability.
Kristen Falkman, voter.
Kyle Shores, Marion County resident.
Jim Reed, Detroit.
Dave Shelton, East resident, Detroit property owner, vice president, North Santiam Chamber of Commerce.
Karen Weaver, the county. Sue Nichols, staff of travel sales, regional marketing manager. Amy Dean, program district, and nursing council.
Diane Tucker, homeowner, and lake voter.
Brian Harper, homeowner, and then
Brady McMahon, U.S. Forest Service District Ranger. Charlie and Kathy Neal, concerned boat owner.
Wendy Gray, homeowner, Detroit.
Dr. Dan, Detroit.
Brandon Reese,
Kyle Lewis, concerned voter.
Dan Pinkston, concerned voter.
Sam Brentano, Marion County Commissioner.
Greg Grandberger with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Factory Manager, Marion Forks, the Minto Fish Facility.
James LeBar, Governor's Office, Regional Solutions.
Thornton Thacker, Mayor of Mill City, Chair of Santiam Kids and Tourism Effort, and a kayaker.
Ken Cartwright, KYAC Community Radio and Television.
Allison McKenzie, local nonprofit Grow Economic Development.
Tony Pinkston, concerned voter. Kathy Price, Detroit property owner and voter.
Hayden Price, Detroit property owner, voter, fisherman.
Dusty Booth, concerned voter. Kyle Rodriguez, concerned voter. Sam.
Paul Carr, part-time resident, voter, and user.
Becky Meyer, Detroit property owner and concerned voter.
Don Meyer.
Tammy Justin, Detroit resident.
Connie Ravinger, Detroit resident, voter.
Doug Clark, resident and voter.
Judy Adams, vote owner and the cemetery, stay in the area.
Charlie Prince, Detroit property owner and business owner.
Bruce Bigland, Detroit homeowner.
Patty Elton, Fresno Lakes. Linda O'Donnell, Mountain High Grocery, homeowner.
Dean O'Donnell, Detroit Lake Business Association. Bob Frank, Detroit Lake Business Association. Eric Page, property owner, mortgage customer since 1971, and Detroit Planning Commission.
Ken Page, homeowner.
Elaine DeGeorge, the Lodge at Detroit Lake.
John Owen, homeowner, property owner, longtime voter.
Sandy Owen, Detroit High School graduate. Realtor and sell a lot of real estate in the area.
Jane Ross, homeowner and professional reporter.
John Ross, Detroit homeowner and
Mike Miller, owner of Grand Storage for
Greg Schrader, proceed, council.
Holly Campbell, property owner, builder, and Keynes Custom.
Jack Campbell, Detroit City Council. Ray French,
Leslie Gilbert, Detroit County.
Walt Collier, Indiana City Council. Is that everything? Good. Quite a collection of people and voters and different agencies. I think this is no doubt the biggest meeting we've ever had for the Atlantic. And this is the biggest venue we have in Canada that can see people, and I see we should have built a little bigger. We're going to move right on to the meeting. Kevin is Kevin Commissioner. Sure.
Well, I want to say thank you. Sorry we were so late. Where's Deputy Zahn? Everybody know Dave from the lake? Dave, where are you?
He's here.
His boat wasn't fast enough. We were out touring the lake. and Dave, thank you very much. I don't know, did you introduce yourself earlier?
No.
Dave's on. Everybody knows Dave from Marion County. Well, seriously, we just got off the lake. We were up there, I've been with the congressman all day. We've been touring the canyon, not only about this issue, but industrial properties up in Indiana. We toured First Lumber today, and we've been looking at the whole economy up here in Marion County, and we call it the North Santiam River Canyon. So this is an important part of the economy up here, and I'm glad that my fellow commissioner Sam Brentano is here with me tonight. We've had several meetings in this hall talking about the economy, and tonight is another one of those, and this is a huge turnout. What I want to say to you tonight is I passed out some cards, and I knew there would be 50 or 60 people in the room, probably like 3 times that. Passed out some cards that if you have a question, I've got some pencils here. You want to write down a question that you have, because there's going to be several people that are going to have the same question, and we're going to try to get to your questions after we get the presentations done tonight. But I want to make sure that you have a chance to do that, so if you want to write those down, if you need a pencil, if you need a card, somebody's probably got some extra cards I passed out there, we want to be able to do that. Also tonight, Barb, are you there with sign-up sheets? They're out front. If you could sign up, they're out right outside the window there before you leave. Or maybe we could pass some of those around. If you could get your email and your name on there, that would be very helpful, because we do want to be able to communicate with you in the future as to things that are going on with the lakes. So I know several of you here, and I want to thank you. I have a boat. It's at Keynes. I have a property on Cluster. I'm with you. I know how you feel right now, and but I do want to share this with you at the beginning of the season. Because of what happened last year, I've been following the lake on my apps. And I don't know if any of you here do. I know, Paige, you got them. And you don't know how many times I've gotten calls from people that I know in this room, or text messages that say, Cameron, they're pouring the water out the top of the dam. And if you look at your app right now, there's 999 cubic feet per second coming out of Big Cliff. That is the flow in the stream. It's not what's coming out over the top of the dam. And you're going to hear a presentation from Army Corps. But what I'm going to ask you tonight is to really have your ears and eyes open and try to listen to educate ourselves what they're trying to accomplish with a very complicated job that they had. But at the beginning of the season, I looked at my wife and I said to Judy, I said, I think our boat is going to be out probably the week after the 4th of July. And she said, why? I said, because we're 14 feet below full pool, and it's now June. And that's where we would be in, what, July or August. And so I knew at the beginning of this year, because I've been paying attention, that we would be out early. And I want to thank the Army Corps, I want to thank Keynes, I want to thank Scott, Detroit Marina for doing what they're doing. And you'd be amazed what we saw today and what they're trying to do to keep us here longer. And I know you've never gone down those steeper ramps before. If we were in a normal year, we would have our boats out already at these water levels. So they're all working to try to keep us here as long as we can. So I just want to set the stage tonight. And Congressman Schrader may want to share with you some of the things we've looked at today and some of the things we've talked about today. But if you can just keep a mind open to what we're going to hear about. And then at the end, we'll have those questions and answers. And I don't think you're going to walk away from here unless we all had a lot of water and jumped in the lake. No, we still couldn't fill it, right? There's no way we're going to fill that lake this year. But in the future, hopefully, based on you being here tonight and us working together with various agencies, we can have a resiliency plan, is what we'll call it, that will help us stay in the lake longer, because it's a huge, huge piece of our economy, not only in this canyon, but throughout Portland and Salem and everywhere. The money that is spent because of what happens up here, and the recreation and the quality of life. So thanks for being here tonight. I want to say a couple things about our congressman. Kurt Schrader has been in Congress. I served with him in the House when I was at the State House. He was a senator before he went to Congress, and he helped me on a couple of bills that I won't mention them because some of you won't like the bill that I passed in sports action. But anyways, this guy works really hard, is a very practical thinker. I call him a blue dog because we're on the opposite side of the aisle if we were in Congress together. But when we get together, we're getting things done. It's not about party, it's not about politics, it's about getting things done. So I want to introduce your congressman for the 5th District, Kurt Schrader.
Well, I'll be brief. I'm here to listen and learn. As Kevin said, served time in the state, veterinarian in the real world. I did have a real job at one point, but did serve in the state legislature a little bit. And this was a problem then. This was a problem then. We had some pretty bad years, early 2000s. It's gotten to the point where it's unacceptable to have this recurring problem again and again and again. There's got to be solutions. I give Kevin and Sam and Janet all the credit in the world. You've got some county commissioners that are not just focused on Salem and down the valley there. They're worried about up here. They want this whole area to be revitalized, to be back, maybe not exactly like it was 20 years ago, but back where it's a vibrant, growing community. And the people I've met today, people I've met past times, there's a lot of vision. There's a lot of people who want this community to grow once again. And I think there's an opportunity for that. We've got some hard lines that maybe we got to throw up and throw away and redo what we're thinking. Today, a few of the business leaders here in the audience met with us just before coming down here and brainstorming a little bit on maybe some short-term things we can do to give maybe some more immediate relief in the short term. Some medium-range projects that we could undertake. Well, I want to hear what you think of them. And maybe some long-range looks at things. Some of the data we've used is very old. You want to be careful what you ask for sometimes. Is new data going to help or hurt our cause up here in the canyon? So we want to think this through very carefully. You guys live, eat, and breathe this issue. You know, I don't. I live down the valley in Canby, for goodness sakes. But you all know what's going on. You know the history better than I do. The only other person I think that probably knows a little bit about how the structure works and can give us a format to maybe get the discussion off and going would be the Army Corps. And Justin's here and some of the rest of the crew, and hopefully give us a common set of data to work on. And he's probably the go-to guy for the real intellectual questions. I'm the guy that can maybe do the political stuff a little. From my end, being in the United States Congress, believe it or not, it's not as bad as it looks on TV. And we actually collaborate a lot. Work closely with Greg Walden, I work with Blumenauer, work with Senator Wyden and Senator Merkley's office. And I work closely with the local officials you have here. Sam and Kevin and Janet consider friends. And the best projects that get the most funding or have the best chance of getting a little resources into smaller communities that frankly just don't have the resources or tax base that they do down in the valley. It's by collaboration. So what I'm hoping to do is take away today, work with your local officials about what the canyon can do, what the county can do, what our state can do. We're represented by the governor's office. Really appreciate them taking a big interest in our area. And then at the federal level, how can we leverage all those resources? And frankly, my experience so far in Congress is there are a lot of bigger states out there, but they fight among themselves. And your Oregon delegation, we may be on different sides of different political issues, but when it comes to the economic good in our state, we generally tend to back each other. And we punch above our weight in Congress because of that. So if we can come up with some really thoughtful solutions and present them, that grant money hopefully will be more accessible to us. And I'm looking forward to a good discussion. Justin, you want to do a takeaway there on the core stuff? Give us some facts.
Yeah, and if you have those cards, we can pass them that way and down. We'll get them up over in the corner and we'll collect them. Or if you, as you write your questions down.
So I'm Dustin Benson. I'm the Deputy Operations Project Manager for the Corps of Engineers in the Willamette Valley. I have been in the Willamette Valley for 23 years. A big chunk of that time started out working on the recreation side, so I'm a recreator. I've got a boat. And I've been here in this area, in this community. I've talked about our operational constraints, the challenges that we're all familiar with on a number of times. But tonight I see a whole lot of new faces, and I'm glad that what we did was we put together a little bit of history so that we all kind of start from a common operating framework and understand what the opportunities are, what some of the constraints are within the system. So, Greg, go ahead and advance the first slide. What I want to do quickly, because I know that there's a lot of questions, is we're going to talk about the Willamette Valley as a system. Make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page in terms of the entire operating project. We're going to talk specifically to water management and challenges in the North Santiam. Some of the details specific to the BIOP and how the BIOP, that those set of actions that we have to take for the federally listed fish species in the basin have impacted water management since 2008. We'll look at this water year because this is truly a unique water year in a lot of ways, and how it unfolded and why we are where we are today. And then we'll transition and we'll talk that resilience piece a little bit. We'll turn that over and make that part of the Q&A. Okay, great. So, background in history, in 1943, this is what the Willamette Valley looked like on a very regular basis. And Greg, the next slide, it's really Flood Control Acts 1936. Congress authorized the Corps of Engineers to look at how to address this problem across the Willamette Valley, this frequent and severe flooding. In 1938, Flood Control Act authorized the construction of the first 7 dams in the valley. Detroit was one of those first 7 dams. Go ahead, Greg. 1940, we started construction. Fern Ridge Dam was the first dam completed in the Willamette. Flood Control Acts of 50 and 62 authorized the remaining 6 projects that I think a number of you are familiar with. And we completed that last project in 1969 at Blue River Reservoir. This is the Willamette Valley. When I talk about the Willamette Valley as a system, it's the 13 dams that we manage as a system to mitigate flood risks on the main stem, the tributaries, and then manage for a number of authorized purposes. The black dots that you see are projects that produce hydropower, 8 of those managed by the Corps. We have a 9th actually that's not reflected on here that's managed by a private entity at Dorena. But that is the Willamette Valley system. 7,000 square miles roughly that we encompass. We manage 24,000 acres of land and quite a bit of water storage capacity in the basin. Talk about authorized project purposes, and I think most everybody is aware that our primary project purpose is flood risk management. We manage these dams for those large, somewhat non-routine events that happen to, we can't control flooding, we can't prevent it downstream, but we can certainly minimize damages to people that live downstream of these dams, things that would have happened on a recurring basis were it not for these projects. Everything else you see underneath it are authorized project purposes that we work to balance and really depend on how we store water in the basin. We produce hydropower. The value of that hydropower is somewhere between $70 and $90 million on an annual basis. We have a navigation authority. We can store water for irrigation purposes, and that irrigation water can be contracted for. Recreation benefits. 3.5 million visitors in the Willamette Valley total. And it's probably a dated number, but in excess of $100 million of economic benefits associated with recreation at these projects. We have fish and wildlife authorities as well, and certainly a lot of what you've seen going on here locally, both in terms of flow and construction, are related to those fish and wildlife authorities. The water that we release improves water quality downstream. We have targets at Albany and Salem for that. And then municipal and industrial water supply, so drinking water and water for industrial support is another authorized purpose of these projects. If you look at where we store water, it's critical not only in terms of the amount, but where it sits in the basin. And Detroit is the second largest storage reservoir in the Willamette Valley. We store in conservation season, so in the summer when we try to have that pool full, we can store about 1.6 million acre feet of water. The way that it's broken out in the basin, the Middle Fork, so up Highway 58, Lookout Point, Hills Creek, Fall Creek, those reservoirs account for the largest portion of our storage. But Detroit is the second largest storage project in the basin. That's significant both in terms of the recreation benefits, but also later on when we talk about how we use it or how we don't use it to meet some of those downstream flow requirements, it's significant as well. So how do we get that water and how do we store it? And we rely on rainfall. Really, rainfall in the months of April, May, and June are what fill our reservoirs. And contrary to, I think, what a lot of folks believe, snowfall doesn't account for a significant amount of our inflow. It's about 10% overall. It does sustain some of our summer flows or our early spring flows. That lower elevation snow can also translate to some flood risk. But it's really rainfall. And when you look at this year, we'll look at this year later, it's the lack of that rainfall in April, May, and June that create really difficult conditions to provide for recreation and the other benefits that we have. So I mentioned the 13 dams are operated as a single system. We manage those dams, we look at tributary flow requirements, but we manage those dams to try to mitigate risks on the main stem of the Willamette River. And if you think back to the last significant flood we had in 1996, the Corps projects had a significant effect on the flood damages associated with that event in 96 and actually even in 97. And we have to work to balance between those other authorized purposes, so hydropower, recreation. We work to balance that stored water, the use of that stored water, to maximize those benefits. And we do that in collaboration with a whole lot of people. And a number of folks, I heard some of the folks that we do that with are represented in this room. But the next slide gives you an example, and this isn't comprehensive. There are more folks than this that weigh in, and Dave can attest to how many different voices are heard when we get into seasons like this, and we start talking about what's being impacted, how do we use the water that's available for the best balance of those purposes. We try to manage to a kind of a basic set of operating criteria for the stored water that we have. I mentioned that we have minimum in-stream flows for fish in April through June. We're trying to meet those targets at Albany and Salem. We have tributary flow requirements in each of the basins. So here in the North Santiam, we have tributary flow requirements that are somewhat specific to fish and wildlife benefits. That main stem augmentation is also July and August. There's our water quality management that we do. And then, of course, we provide for water out-of-stream needs, the refill and drawdown priorities I'll define a little bit later, and also special operations. So we've been doing a lot of evaluation of the operation of our dams, what changes we have to make to meet our requirements under the biological opinion. So that's an example of a special operation that we would use stored water for. Drawdown priorities. And for the Detroit community, I think it's particularly important, especially in April through June, to look at what our priorities are, where we use water first and where we don't. If you think of Detroit, again, second largest reservoir in the basin, it is the last priority for flow augmentation. And in a year even like this, where our main stem targets were incredibly difficult to meet, and we didn't meet in some circumstances, Detroit wasn't used for flow augmentation. That didn't have an impact on the stored water. That is primarily due to the fact that there's a high level of recreation development and where it sits in the basin. So it sits relatively low in the basin. It can help with the Salem target. It can't really help us at Albany. But Detroit, Fern Ridge, and Foster, high recreation development, high impacts, that's recognized, and that is part of the decision-making process for how we use that stored water. Our July through October priorities, again, very similar. And you see Detroit being used last and us balancing stored water throughout the basin from other places. And we'll see the effect of that. I think some of you are familiar with the teacup diagram, but you'll see the effect of that in a year like this and how those projects all look after that, those considerations are made. So, water control diagram. I think that a number of you have heard about the water control diagram. Some of you probably refer to it as the rule curve, but it is our authorized operation for the project, and each one of our dams has a specific authorization, a rule curve associated with it. It was based on analysis of flood risks and the hydraulic science of the day. This was tied to part of that original authorization and construction. It is in the 50s that was done. And it sets those basic guidelines for risk management and balancing project benefits. So just a quick show of hands. Who has not seen this before? Just curious, because we've showed it a lot, and I don't want to shortcut it, but I don't want to spend too much time. If you look at the horizontal axis, it's January through December. The vertical axis is elevation. So elevation in Detroit Reservoir, the one that most folks are concerned with, is 1563.5. That's a full conservation pool. But if you look back, and I like to start at November. If you start at November, when flood risks in the valley start to increase, almost all of our pools are down at their lowest levels. We're trying to create the most storage capacity that we can for those storm events that come in through the winter months. And you see us holding pretty tightly to that. We'll store water, and then as the unregulated tributaries recede, as downstream flows recede, we'll release that water in ways that minimizes or eliminates damage downstream. And we manage that way up until the 1st of February as that risk goes down to flooding downstream. And then you see us slowly start to fill over a 2-month period, targeting early May, and it's early May here in Detroit, to have those pools full, what we call full conservation pool, trying to store that 1.6 million acre feet of water, as much of that as we can in that conservation season for all of those benefits. What is a bit unique about Detroit is you've got 37,000 acre feet, about 11 feet on the top of that maximum conservation pool, and that is because we get spring storms here. There is a need to store water, and you can look at the period of record. Some of you that have been here for years know that we have bumped up over that elevation. We'll get a June event, and we have to have capacity to store that water. So there you see that additional storage capacity on top. Example of that, if you look at 2009, in May, we had a storm event, and we ended up releasing about 10,000 cubic feet per second of water. Anybody live in the Fisherman's Bend area? Anybody familiar with the Fisherman's Bend area? Mm-hmm. At about 12,000 CFS, people have a hard time getting into their homes or can't get into their homes. That's one of the constraints, and it's an immediate constraint downstream. So you see in a storm event in early spring, where we have managed and we're sitting up near the top of the curve, what our required release is there, and how that impacts people kind of immediately downstream of the dam. That's why we maintain that storage capacity. That's why you see a conservative fill line. That black line is our authorized operation. The red line is what actually happened in that year. Okay, so in that year, we didn't have a lot of rainfall, and then boom, we had a spike event that filled that pool and required us to release downstream, and you see how that trended out over the season. But it's that potential for flooding downstream that we manage for. We have to be very careful on how we fill that reservoir in the early spring to not increase risk and damages downstream. Right? So here's an actual, and thinking about last year and this year, it goes from July to July. And of course, last year, everybody knows, was a historic drought. Right? We haven't seen that kind of condition before. And you see, really, even into October and November, how low we got. We were within, Tim, what was it? A day?
About 1 foot, yeah. So
a day of not being able to generate power, which has not happened to us before at Detroit. And then we got a little bit of a storm event, and then of course December was very wet for us, and so we recovered, and essentially we're back to normal operation. You see in January and February, March, you see little rain events. You see us tracking. That blue line is actual, that red line is our curve. You see us tracking. But then look at April, May, and June. And the green line is inflow, so what's coming in from rainfall. And the blue line is what our outflow is. And you really see in April, May, and June that we didn't get any rain. We just didn't have precipitation in those months. And that is what we count on for refill in most years. So how does what does refill look like over the project history? So 1953 to 2016. That red line up on top, where most of the blue lines meet, is our normal conservation pool. That's 1563.5. And if you look across that line, you see how many years we've hit that or slightly exceeded it because of storm events, and where we have it. And what did we calculate, Greg? Was it 6 or 7 when we looked at this? 6 or 7 years over the 63-year project history that we didn't fill the reservoir. So from the standpoint of that fill curve, over that period of time, pretty consistently, you see that reservoir being filled. Now you see some of the big anomalies jump out at you, 2001, 2015, and Greg, if you go to the next slide, it'll take a second. This is the colorful spaghetti. But this is the last 15 years, including this year. And you see the two big events that most people remember. The blue line that's way down there is 2000, this is 2001, this is 2015, and then that thicker yellow line up top is 2014. But in most years, over the last 15 years, you see us reaching full pools somewhere in that May-June time frame. And what has more of an impact, or has been more of the discussion over the past 15 years, has been what's going on that back end in the months of August and September, and how long we can sustain that pool elevation, the marinas, the access for boaters in the reservoir. And that primarily is due to downstream release requirements, so our minimum tributary requirements, what we lose through evaporation, and really the variability of what comes in and inflow over the course of this summer. So what are those flow requirements? And I will tell you that if you have real specific questions about the BIOP, I have a phone a friend, Greg Taylor, project fish biologist, that can talk with you about that. But the basics I think you know, and if you watch that curve very closely, you see us meeting a target in February to March of 1,000 CFS, ramping up to that 1,500 CFS requirement in the BIOP in May, or March through May, back down again in June to July, and then back up again in the fall. Okay, and in years like this, and as you mentioned earlier, depending on what's going on in the water year, that group that I identified earlier, that collaborative group of decision makers, really work to try to figure out how to maximize stored water to prolong certain things that are both good for recreation and for fish. You mentioned that you see water spilling out of the dam. And the reason that you see water spilling out of the dam in June is not because we're releasing more water, it's because we're mixing water for temperature. We're trying to improve temperature conditions downstream, and the way that we do that currently is we spill water from the spillway gates, and then we use flow through the turbines to mix water in Big Cliff and improve water quality downstream. So if you see water spilling in Detroit, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're releasing more water. It is the Big Cliff number that you look at on those teacup diagrams that will tell you what we're actually releasing. So I mentioned the BIOP a couple of times, what some of our requirements are. Of course, there's a lot of research and evaluation going on. Downstream fish passage, which is something that we have to address at some point here. Long-term temperature control, what will that look like? Will it be a structural fix, and what will that structural fix be? We have other RPAs. We've completed the Minto collection facility. Greg manages that. Next slide, Greg. Big issues for us, though. Meeting those targets, those ramp rates and flow targets. So we don't want to ramp up too quickly, we can't ramp down too quickly, or we strand fish, we impact those species. And that does have an effect on how much we can shape those releases and those effects on the pool. And then, we mentioned some of the interim operations to improve conditions earlier. But really, ramp rates and flow targets, those are the things that have the most impact late in the season to what that pool elevation looks like in any given year.
Hey, Dustin?
Yeah?
Is this going to be made available to us?
I can certainly put that out for folks, and I will say this, I know it's hard for people to hear, so I'll talk with Dave after this, and if there are folks that really couldn't get all of this, we'll come back, and we'll be happy to do this for folks again.
Thanks.
So, limits of forecasting, right, and how predictable it is, and this is something we talked about earlier. We get an April forecast, and we use that to project what stored water will be like for the year and what those conditions are. It corresponds roughly with this meeting in early April. And what we have are probabilities at that point. And what you can see from our April forecast this year, in every probability that we modeled, we looked like we were going to fill. And I'll show you some of what went into that based on that history. What we ended up with was significantly different than that. And those exceedance curves, so how likely is it to be at that level or better? That brown line, that one that's the worst case scenario, even in that scenario, the 5% exceedance, we projected, we modeled that this reservoir would fill this year. Snowpack. The perception is that we had a lot of snowpack. I know some folks felt like it was there, but really, overall, we were below average in snowpack. You saw a buildup of that in December, and then we had a warm February, and it was even fairly warm in March. And throughout the rest of that time, we really had less than average snowpack in the basin as well. Again, doesn't help us fill the reservoir because typically in May and June, a lot of that snowpack is already gone, but it does help sustain some of those flows early in the spring. Next slide, Greg. So how did this season unfold? And this first graph really shows what happened temperature-wise, and I won't dig into the details, but what it will show is if you look at February, March, April, May, and June, I think we've got July in there. Warmer, right? Significantly warmer than we have been historically. Above 6 degrees in the month of April, and I think everybody remembers how hot and dry April was this year. So extremely warm weather. Next slide, Greg. Precip, and really what happened to us overall. If you look at February, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 90% rainfall. In March, we had 130% of normal precip, right? Right about that time where we're preparing that April forecast and projecting out, we have 130% or so of normal precip over most of the basin. And then in the months of April, May, and June, it shuts off. It stops raining. And that's the point where we start falling below that even worst case scenario refill curve. And if that rain doesn't come, there's really not an opportunity to catch up. If that inflow isn't there, because we have to maintain some minimal flows downstream, we can't catch up to that. So without that spring rainfall, and that's what makes this such a difficult and unusual year, we have a pool early in the season like this that's below where we would normally be. This is just a different graphic that shows you the little hash mark lines are the water year to date and really where we were in terms of percent of average and precip in any given month. But again, look how low April and May were. June was around May, a little bit lower than that. So, Detroit forecast, and this is where it all comes together. You see those minimum releases. You see us, and 1546 is an elevation that we commonly look at and talk about being critical to boating, although there is still boating opportunity available. We know that the marine owners are affected at or around that level. You see us falling below that. We're at 1544 and change today. So we're already below that much earlier in the year. The green and the blue line down on the bottom though, and I draw your attention back to that. That's that inflow and outflow. There were accommodations made. We did reduce minimum tributary flows to try to retain water, both for recreation and for fish. We tried to prolong that temperature operation because we can only do that temperature mixing above elevation 1544. When we fall below that elevation, we can't provide temperature benefits downstream. So that interest of storing water for recreation and storing water for fish benefits, they line up typically, and in a year like this, helped us negotiate those decisions to reduce some of those flows. But there are limits to what we can drop those to before we start having significant effects downstream as well. How does Detroit fare? So it's the last on our drawdown list. We had a tough refill year across the basin. This is where we are today. I'll give you a link at the end. The teacup diagram is a great way to stay up to date on where we're at in any given year. But if you look across the basin in terms of where our pool levels are and which are hardest hit, Detroit's sitting about 72% full. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that that's ideal or that you should be happy about that, but it is significantly better than where we're at in a number of other places in the basin. Primarily because we pulled really hard on a lot of the Middle Fork projects to meet those main stem flow requirements. Fern Ridge, again, based on that operation, you see Fern Ridge sitting at about 92% full. Fern Ridge can't contribute a significant amount to those main stem targets, and again, has that high recreation benefit. And so you see those projects prioritized in terms of how we use water, even in really difficult years. So overall, while the picture is certainly not as bad as it was last year, but not ideal, you still see quite a bit of stored water in Detroit and some recreation opportunities preserved as a part of that process. This is an ideal year, right? Does anybody remember 2011? I mean, what does it take for us to have this, from a recreation standpoint, near perfect operation? And again, that black line is the authorized curve and the red line is the actual. And really, it was that spring rainfall. If you look at April, May, June, and even July of that year, we had rainfall, we had significant rainfall that allowed us to not only fill, but keep that pool elevation up. But that's a pretty unusual set of events, right? It's pretty unusual for us to get that consistent rainfall in June and July. And so to get to that kind of ideal operation requires a fairly unique set of environmental or weather events to happen for us as well. So I will transition into the discussion of building resilience. I mean, I think that there's a lot of discussion going on around climate variability. Certainly there are limitations with the infrastructure that we have and future improvements that we have to make in that infrastructure that while they have the potential to impact recreation folks in the community, I've been coming up here for 15 years. And I can tell you that none of those things will sneak up on you. There will be an opportunity for the public to understand, to provide comment, to shape to the extent that we can how we manage those requirements, how we manage those construction activities, whatever those issues are, in the best way that we can to protect those interests and balance those benefits. But I'm excited to be part of and continue to be part of the discussion on resilience because I do think there's opportunities. I think we've been talking about some of those opportunities for more than a dozen years. And it's a couple of years back to back like this that really bring those needs into focus. And so in a tough year, in a tough set of economic conditions, I think we do have an opportunity to reshape some of those constraints and improve the conditions for folks in the basin. And with that, I will make this available. The last slide are some links to our reservoir levels, questions if you have for our public affairs office, and I will be around obviously to answer questions and anything else you need from me for the rest of the evening.
So we're gonna have some other people speak. Brady, points. You've got any cards, if you can pass up any questions that you want to ask, if you can pass them around a card. This person was smart to ask for 5 questions on one card. Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Brady McMahon, ranger from the Forest Service up in Detroit. And just some short updates, just real quick. We always like to touch base and let you know what we've been up to at the reservoir. And this year, it's been a good year for us. Obviously, the beginning started off really quick. We had lots of water to start with. We didn't quite fill, but still all of our facilities were functional. And we got lake sweeping done, which is where we remove all the logs from the reservoir. It was a little bit difficult for us this year because we store those logs at a place we need to be at full pool to put them. So we had to instead store them in a different place this year. So a little different, but we did get that stuff done. Actually, still Piety Island, where we have a campground. That is still an island, but not for much longer. So that's been going on well. It's been, and all of our facilities have been really at capacity. And I know state parks have been at capacity too. I think there was a sense of pent-up use. You know, pent-up wanting to get out there and use the reservoir this year from last summer. It was really not much at all. So our use figures have been really up, and everybody has been really working well together. I want to thank the county for all your help with the reservoir this summer. Also, the fish folks, ODFW, thank you for all your help too, with lake sweeping and everything else. So really good. Right now, currently the south side of the lake, Cove Creek, those boat ramps are right at water level right now at the total of the boat ramps. Those are about done for the year. I know that there's a lot of facilities that are right about that point right now. So we've been lucky this year with the blue-green algae. Every year we seem to get a peak of blue-green algae, and that can become a concern. But it peaked this year and it's dropped off again. Some of that topsoil in the core does also helps us with that sometimes, because that does take some of the blue-green algae off the top and help drop that down some. So overall, a good year, although from here on down it's going to be a little bit trickier. We have 3 floating restrooms on the reservoir. 2 of those are still functional. The one up the Brighton Bush arm is we're going to need to move that down pretty soon because it's going to be running out of water soon. So we're going to be moving things around a little bit to continue to use the reservoir the best we can all through Labor Day. So there's definitely still lots of opportunities with the lower boat ramp, with the winter boat ramp. You know, the reservoir is always usable. It's just how much of it we can use. But even last summer, there was still a lot of good recreational reservoir.
Sir, could you speak up just a little bit?
Okay, sorry, I heard you back there. Okay, I'm done.
I'll just keep it brief. My name's Greg Grandmember, I'm the hatchery manager for North Santiam, ODFW. Just wanted to talk about a little bit about the success so far this year for Minto. We're having a record summer steelhead run for us so far. We haven't seen a run like this since '06. These returning adults are the first year we had a long-term acclimation on smolts at the new facility. So whether it's an anomaly of great ocean conditions or just great summer steelhead run, it's just going gangbusters. We worked almost 3,000 steelhead in the last 4 weeks, and they seem to keep coming.
Anybody else?
Okay.
Is that it? Is that the updates? Is that all the updates?
Yes, sir. We're ready for Q&A.
So we got some questions and answers, and before or not answers, we got questions. I don't have a lot of answers. But before I do that, I wanted to introduce a few other people that were on our tour with us today. Fritz, did you get a chance to say hello? Fritz Graham is with Senator, I always get him back, Wyden's office. Senator Wyden's office, he was on the tour, he was out on the boat in those clothes. Can you believe that? but the sheriff made him wear a life jacket. Barb from our office is back there. Some other people that are around here. A couple people in the back that, and this question is for you, Ed. Ed Flick is our emergency manager. Ed, raise your hand. Okay, and we can point you. This is the first part of this question I don't understand. Are we flushing sewage down the Willamette River with Detroit Lake water? And the second half of this question is, do we have a drought plan for the North Santiam Canyon? And can you tell us where we're at with that?
Yeah, I can't really address the first question, but the second question, with the leadership of the Watershed Council and a number of other jurisdictions, we're well into developing a drought contingency plan. We have gone through 2 big rounds of planning. We've looked at monitoring, and we've looked at vulnerabilities, and we had folks at the table to understand what different water levels meant to different users, from the folks in Idana all the way down to the Salem water supply. The next step will begin to look at the mitigation things that can be done, and that'll be a landing spot for some of the ideas that we generate. And that plan will really be wrapping up in the September-October timeframe. And again, I'm not the lead agency for it, but I'm just impressed with the leadership in the watershed that brought that resource to the community. And it's a great place to tee up all of these issues back to the Bureau of Reclamation, and it'll ultimately lock up or unlock funding that you get when you have such a plan.
Okay, thank you. So what staff took several of your questions and put them all in one card. Nobody put 5 questions on one card. Staff did that, I guess, so to make it easy on me, but they know how I can't follow directions anyways. Okay, so first question, maybe this goes back to Army Corps. Why can't we hold water back earlier, say in February?
Okay. So, and I think something I went through earlier, but just to talk about it again, what we're doing is trying to manage those downstream risks to life and property, right? Diminish flood risks downstream while storing water for conservation season needs. If you look at the period of record and the success in refilling the reservoir, 7 times out of 63, we're filling that reservoir. But if we cheat that, if we fill sooner, if we fill in December, in January, in February, what that translates to at some level is increased risk downstream of flooding. That's less storage capacity than we have available to us. And while that curve could be modified, it isn't something that just happens in kind of a mental decision. It's something that comes through analysis of downstream risks and it looks at the basin hydrology. And as was mentioned earlier, the results of that evaluation could mean better conditions for recreation in Detroit. It could mean a more conservative refill cycle because of the risks downstream. But that's why we don't just capture water sooner. Now, in some years, I will say that when you have severe drought conditions, we have captured small amounts of water early in the season, but not water that we can't evacuate in a pretty short time frame. So, if you look back at the operational history, there are periods where we look out a ways, and those are called deviations. Those deviations are something that we run through a process and we have approved, but when you think about consistent deviations, something that we do year in and year out, that's the point in which you really need to look at a permanent modification of the water control diagram and the analysis that would go with it. So the reason we don't store water earlier primarily is to manage that flood risk downstream for the people that live below the dams.
So, and a question that's on this same card, what would it take to update the curve? And I think I heard you say a pretty in-depth analysis. Be careful what we ask for.
Remember, it wouldn't be just Detroit, because Detroit is not operated in isolation. We would have to look at the Willamette Valley as a system and look at all of those risks and how changes to Detroit's water control diagram would affect people's safety downstream. It would require a study. It would require a caution response to do that. And there's a process for that. But I think in terms of the potential solutions that are out there, the things that were discussed earlier, there are opportunities that are there that have more certainty. There's more certain outcomes from that investment of dollars.
Another question that's on here is, are other lakes low? I think we saw that. Fern Ridge was the highest percentage though, but I've been to Fern Ridge. It's a pretty shallow lake. In fact, I've fallen water skiing and been standing up in places there. Yeah. And then another question that's on here is, how can we help and stay informed? How can we in this room help and stay informed?
So the list of folks that are involved in our water management decisions, I think almost everybody in here has some connection to those folks that were listed, whether it's elected officials, government folks. Dave sits in on those meetings for this committee as well. There's an opportunity to make sure that your concerns, your interests are understood. So there's one way that's already in place that you can communicate back to those groups and get clarity. Some of what we listed at the end, there's a whole lot of opportunities out there, different ways you can get information on what current water levels are, but recognize the limits of forecasting too. What we try to do is give an indication in early April, but obviously there are limits to that forecasting capability, and we make an awful lot of adjustments. It's just not always visible during the year to try to best balance those needs for recreation and downstream. So I won't tell you that there isn't more that we can learn. You should always try to influence and communicate through those groups. But boy, I can tell you from experience, the recreation interests in Detroit are always in those conversations. Everybody that's involved in that understand what it means to this community. And you see those changes. They can't necessarily make it perfect, but in years like this, they make it better than it could have been.
Is it possible to dredge under the marinas to make them deeper and last the season longer?
Yeah. And that is something that we discussed earlier at the meeting. It's something that we talked about in 2009. And there is a process and analysis that would have to be done there of the environmental impacts. There's a permitting process for that dredging, and we would be part of supporting that evaluation and that process development. They said we started that back in 2009, and there's a funding issue. It's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be easy to dredge into those marinas, and that's where I think a number of the other folks that were introduced earlier are looking to find ways to facilitate that type of solution for the marina owners of Detroit.
I think that's where Kurt mentioned us working together, federal, state. James LaBarre is here. James LaBarre from the Governor's Office Regional Solutions is on the tour with us today. I forgot to mention that. And so the state, the county, we have lottery dollars that we can use for economic development projects. The state has resources. If we can come up with plans to potentially help the marinas with that project, and we're going to have to analyze that a little bit more. There's no promises here, but we were really encouraged when I heard that today from Core, they would support that. That, for example, right now, if you were at Detroit Lake Marina, I met with Scott. Scott and I toured for an hour and a half on Saturday. He literally could get another, couple of weeks out of his marina, even at the level that we're at today. So that would be a resiliency plan in these lower water years to help extend the recreational time with the marinas. The Core posts 1563.5 and 1569, both as full pool. The lake fill stopped May 30th at 1553. Please clarify which full pool number is accurate and explain the failure to fill and who is accountable.
Yeah. So I think the confusion there is between what is our max pool and what is full conservation pool. And as I mentioned earlier, we have storage capacity on top of that maximum conservation pool. That's 1563.5. That's the target that we fill to every year. But everything above that, all the storage capacity we have above that, is exclusively reserved for flood management, right? Flood water management, storm inflows. What happened this year, and I think I mentioned it earlier, when we don't get spring rain, when it doesn't rain in April, May, and June, refill across the valley is very, very difficult to achieve. And in a year like this, where you have an extremely wet March, and then no rain in April, May, and June, projecting that kind of shortfall is almost impossible to do as well. I don't know what the answer is to making the modeling or the projections more accurate. I know there are limitations to it, and we use the best available science, but there are going to be years like this where things happen and the rain doesn't come, and we can't fill that reservoir. We can't make it up through other measures without having significant consequences downstream. And think about what's downstream, not just flood risk management. We have the fish flows, but you've got drinking water supply for the city of Salem and a number of other communities downstream as well. All of those things are considered as part of the minimum flow requirement. So again, balancing those upstream and downstream needs in a year like this is challenging. In some ways more challenging than it was last year.
So would that be accurate? We were 11 feet below full pull this year when we got to the max, or was it 14?
What did we peak out at?
Well, I think he had it on there, what was it,
1553.97,
yeah,
right? So that would be 10 feet below or 11 feet below what your target would be.
Yep.
Right.
I've heard 11, I've heard 14, so it was 11 feet. So when would we be 11 feet below full pool on a normal year on the curve? What, July?
Well, again, the curve would indicate that you can keep the pool full the entire summer, right? But historically, you've got some drawdown because you're releasing 1,000 CFS, 1,200 CFS, you've got 400 or 500 CFS coming in. So, it depends on what that inflow is each year. But yeah, it would be later, definitely.
Like July?
August or
Yeah.
September
Okay.
timeframe, that you see us falling in.
Okay. Does the overall financial impact to the community and property owners, campgrounds, and businesses even matter? That's why we're here. Yeah, it does. It does matter. That's why we're all here tonight.
Well, it also matters with regard to core projects. If we want to get the core engaged in doing something, the economic impact to the community can sometimes make a huge difference, and it's a lot easier to sell a project if you're trying to get grant monies back in DC.
Perfect. So we need to take a picture of this group so the congressman can show it on the floor back there, right? One more question we have time for, or what?
No, I have part of an answer.
Oh, Dave?
Yeah, back in 2001 was a real bad year, and that's when we formed this committee after that. We had an economic impact study done by the Oregon State University, and just to highlight it was asked what happens up in the canyon, and just not Detroit, but say from Mahima up, they're all affected by this, gas stations, restaurants. And it came out that they lost or we lose 127 jobs. People say, that's not much. We asked them to compare that to the economic area of Salem. When you look at that whole thing, that number changed to 8,863 jobs. Now, if you were in the Salem area or in the valley, and you had an employer that shuts down with 8,000 or 8,800 jobs, I think there would be a lot of attention. The amount of money was like $4 million or $5 million. But we did this, and it just shows that what happens.
And good things happen out of these bad things, and I'll say, the reason we had the low water ramp was because of what happened in 2001. That low water ramp, which even after your boats have to be out next weekend or the weekend after, you can still get on that low water ramp till 1,450 feet, and as I would do, I'd do an anchor buddy my boat for the weekend and still have a good time if you can find a place to do that. But things like that come out of this where we can, whether it's the dredging projects or the low water ramp, etc., because it does matter. This economy up here matters. That's why you're all here. You know, you could probably take 1 or 2 families out of this group and just say, you spend probably up at Canes or Detroit Lake Marina for the summer, probably an average of $2,000 to $3,000 per family. And you drop how much up at Dean buying liquor in the liquor store. Dean, are you here? Are you stocked up? We may need some after this meeting. We have a no. What's our policy? I can't drink. Yeah. Okay. And then I have one last one here that unless there's something else we haven't touched on, that, sure.
I'm just curious. There's 2 dams on the Sandy.
There's 2 what?
2 dams. There's
Detroit
and there's Big Cliff.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, why they couldn't drop the water behind the Big Cliff Dam, and in the winter, if they need to dump, they could fill that up so that they could get that start.
I can answer that question. Because if you have the app on your phone, the deal he just showed right there, you can follow the elevation on Big Cliff. Big Cliff is the regulating dam. So if you look at Big Cliff, it's the steady flow of what's coming down the Santiam always. So when he says they're at 1,000 cubic feet per second, that's what's coming out of Big Cliff. We were out on the boat, I think, today, and I popped that up, and it was at 999, and Detroit was at 0. There was no water coming out of Detroit Dam for a couple hours this afternoon. We looked at it. I just looked at it while I was sitting up there, and it was at 23 or 1900 or something, because they're probably generating power and refilling Big Cliff. I don't know if anybody's ever noticed, if you drive up, if you ever go up, and sometimes Big Cliff is way down, and then you go home at night or you go down and now it's way up, it'll fluctuate all day long. So Big Cliff is similar to Fern Ridge, and people ask me all the time about what's the one below Fern Ridge everybody goes skiing on.
Are you thinking of the little lookout? Dexter?
No. Sweet Home. Green Peter and Foster. Foster is a regulating dam for Green Peter. Green Peter is feeding Foster all the time, and so they keep that one up, and it's bigger than Big Cliff. So that's why. I got that one. I figured that out last year, I think, finally.
And I'd add this. If you fill Big Cliff, there's about 8,000 acre feet of storage. That really equates to about 2 feet in Detroit. Detroit has a swing of over 300,000 acre feet that they can store. So you can see it just, even if beyond the operational constraints, there just isn't meaningful capacity. Big Cliff wasn't built to store that.
That's a great question, though. It's an important one. So if you're looking at flows, look at Green Peter. Don't look at Detroit. Yeah, question. I mean, look at Big Cliff. Don't look at Detroit. Yeah. I told you I can't get things straight. Yeah.
Has anyone ever quantified the economic engine of Detroit to the other recreational dam areas to determine how much revenue is generated by the facility being where it is as compared to the use levels of the other reservoirs?
Well, Dave said we did that Oregon State study back in 2001 about the economic impact of the reservoir. Wasn't that what you just said?
Yes.
I don't think that was compared against other reservoirs, right? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I'm concerned about, obviously, the business community and support services that are here in Detroit, especially for the homeowners and for the recreational boaters and so on and so forth. And
after a year like we had in 2015 and the economic struggles that the businesses went through. Here now in 2016, they're going to lose 30 to 33% of their annual revenues because of the water levels.
Right.
Now, I don't know very many businesses that can take those kinds of hits 2 years in a row and survive.
That's correct.
So what are the rest of us going to do when we need to go to the grocery store or buy gas when the gas station's out of business? I mean, is it just not within the purview of the Army Corps to take into the account the economic health of the community when it makes these decisions?
I think, go ahead.
I mean, in terms of managing water, in terms of prioritizing stored water in Detroit, I would go back to the slides that I showed earlier. We use Detroit as, we prioritize recreation and storage in Detroit over all of those other reservoirs. And that is a direct reflection of the economic benefits associated with stored water use. I don't know quite how to answer your question other than to say it is recognized and it is part of how we manage water. But in a year like 2015 and a year like this, we can't make up that water. We can't fill that any other way than through precipitation. So yes, it is understood. I don't know if quantifying it further would change that operation or how we would prioritize it any more significantly than we do right now.
So this curve that you're shooting for, I mean, will that require an act of Congress to change that? I mean, it seems no one here really, the question about filling the pool early, I mean, we all know that doesn't make any sense to fill a thing in December, but it seems like it makes sense to maybe jump 1 month, just 1 month, and have the pool a little bit higher to start with. So you have, because you're always working in the rears. I mean, do you have any latitude to jump the curve a little bit? Or does that require?
It would require a change in that authorization. So what that would mean, and as I mentioned earlier, it would be something called, terminology is probably that significant, post-authorization change request. We would have to look at Detroit, and we would have to look at Detroit in the context of the entire basin, and say, what would that mean to downstream risk and all of the other benefits and constraints that we have if we were to modify the operation of Detroit in that way. And I couldn't stand here and tell you today exactly how that would turn out. We just couldn't. We would evaluate, we'd use the best science we have available to us. We'd evaluate those economic impacts of risk downstream. We'd evaluate the benefits to recreation and the values associated with them. And that would turn out the way it would turn out. But if you think about 1953, just in basic terms, 1953, and the infrastructure that was in place or potentially at risk of flooding in 1953, and what level of development is downstream today, it at least raises the question, what would that evaluation look like? Would we get more aggressive in refill or more conservative? And I'm not even sure, if you look at the history, you have 2015, historic drought year. There was probably nothing that could have been done. There certainly wasn't anything that could have been done to fill the pool in that year. But over that period of record, refill typically is not the challenge. It's usually sustaining a pool elevation that's adequate for boating in the marinas on the back end of next season. So, and again, I'll make these things available. You can look at that history again. But that idea of reshaping refill, and does that solve the problem for those marina owners? I don't know that it does. But the idea of dredging and providing additional capacity does address kind of the most immediate.
And I think what you hear here underlined is be careful what you ask for. You open up a study like that, and now how many people live down in the Willamette Valley, how much property is down there, and you start mitigating or you start analyzing all that flood risk down there versus where it was in 1950 when it was done. So the risk is even greater now. And you have I'm going to use the word that some people don't like to use. If you have climate change and you've got less snowpack and you've got more rain, you've got less storage capacity in the mountains, and you've got higher, bigger rainstorms, and those comes with the changes that we're having, you might end up with a curve that says, oh, not only are you going to not fill sooner, you're going to hold back later, and you're going to go to 1425 because we have more potential for more flooding. That is what you risk in opening that up. So I'm just saying that from what I've learned.
The storage for all the parties involved that's golden.
Oh, it is.
I mean, if we could be there,
Right.
I mean, it's all the uses, whether it's downstream, whether it's the cities and all
But
that.
the issue is the flood risk, that if you open that can of worms for flood risk, you risk of keeping more.
You got it right for 55 years with the slide rule.
Right.
So, we got the computers, and it isn't working out so well.
Yeah. Anyways, so but this year wasn't a reason. I'm just say I'm one of you. I got a boat. I got a house up there. I knew last year that I wasn't gonna. And thanks to where's Dane and Scott? Where's the marina owners?
They're outside.
Yeah, last year those guys worked their butts off to get us some slips and keep our RVs up there. This year they're doing everything they can to keep us there. It's the rain. Last year we had no rain. We had no snowpack. I mean, there's nothing that Army Corps could have done. This year maybe they could have held it back further, but they can't based on that law, that rule curve. And if you ask them to go back and analyze that, be careful what we ask for. Because in today's environmental world, it may come out worse. And you fill later, or you fill, it could be a problem. I'm just saying, I'm with you guys. I'd like to see it fill, but it's a challenge down the road.
In June of 2001, the Oregon Legislative Assembly.
Oh yeah, I know what you're reading.
What does that?
It's a Senate memorial, right?
What does this?
It's a piece of paper. In fact, you probably, your name's probably on that. You were in 2003. Yeah. In fact, Schrader's name's probably on that, isn't it? You got the senators on there? That, people have shown that to me. It's a Senate joint memorial. Isn't that what it says at the top? That is, you probably spent, what, $3,000 in taxpayer money to write that piece of paper? That means, hey, we care about this, but it doesn't mean anything. It's not a law. It just says we care. And we'll probably see some of those come out in the next legislative session. I already talked to Representative Springer today. So you can send those. Those help when we're going to Congress or we're going back and we're trying to put grants together. It says that our state representatives or our senators care about this issue and they want to put some attention to it. It's just a memorial. It's not a law. All right? Am I right on that? You want to comment on that?
It's establishing a priority, but
Right.
it doesn't make you have to. The goal is to influence the Corps, influence your congressional delegation, your governor, everyone to say, hey, this is a big deal, and you've got not just the people that represent this area directly, but people in Grants Pass, people in Ontario, people in Portland, saying this is a priority. So the more people you get on those, you hope to get a little more attention from all the players out there.
Good. Okay.
I legislated that, and that was passed 100% by every person in the legislature.
Right. But it just means we support what you're trying to
That is correct.
accomplish. Okay. Anything we haven't talked about yet? Different subjects.
Is there any funding currently available to help mitigate this kind of variability that we're seeing for locals? Like, is there any funding available to Congress or the federal government that will help communities adjust?
Here's what I would say. If there's some economic development projects, we have our economic development funds that communities can apply for grants, businesses can apply for grants. Those are things that could be used towards this. Obviously, the commissioners make decisions when those things come around. So yeah, when we talk about the dredging issue, for example, those would be the types of things, once the marinas figured out what they were going to do, they could apply for various grants. I'm sure there's some economic dollars at the state that we would probably go after, federal grants to try to help them with those types of issues, yes.
So not under resiliency?
It would be a resiliency, business development,
Okay.
economic development grants in my case, for a business to help them stay in business or not lose 33% of their business this year. You have another question?
Yeah, I'm just curious, when it comes to the overall flood control and the risk of property downstream, where does FEMA play into this? And hasn't there been adjustments to prevent flooding on downstream since 1953?
That may be
And
an
adjustments to the map?
That may be an Ed Flip.
There's periodic evaluations of the floodplain that relates to the mitigation of flooding. But that really relates more to insurance in the case of flood than it does to mitigate the flow of flood water. There's been a lot of work done by the city of Salem and other jurisdictions to do flood monitoring to try and mitigate and take actions that will reduce the effects of a flood should it come. But there's not a lot that the flood insurance program does to reduce the flow, except to change over time how where you can build.
So FEMA has nothing to do with any of this? They're not involved in any of it?
FEMA may have funds for hazard mitigation, and that's something that we're pursuing to look at how we can get the assessment done, for example, on mitigation. So writing that into the county hazard mitigation plan is part of our strategy to get these issues to FEMA.
Okay. Good. Well, you've had your hand up a couple times.
Yeah, Kevin, so I'm trying to understand what it is we should leave here with. If we all buy into global warming, climate change.
I didn't say global warming, did I? And I didn't say what causes climate change, did I?
No.
What happened to the dinosaurs?
I want to know if we buy into that's happening, and it appears that it is.
Well, it is.
What should we do if you say we should be careful what we wish for? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, if somebody else is going to take care of our problem, or what should we do if we shouldn't be wishing for this? What should we do?
No. I'm just saying, I'm not saying that you shouldn't, we shouldn't ask for that reevaluation of the curve, but don't be upset if it comes out not in your favor, right? And that's all I'm saying is that I would rather go after some of the resiliency things to keep the marinas more flexible with lower water levels. Because watch, I mean, in 2 years from now, we're all going to be going, nobody's going to be up here in the July meeting because you're all going to be out on your boats, right? So, just be careful of what we really try to go after and what we might get in response to that. That's my only point.
So I guess there's some takeaways. I'd be interested in your guys' takeaways too from the meeting. A lot of stuff's been discussed, but the short-term obvious thing that maybe we'd like to work on would be what the marinas are talking about, doing some sort of dredging, increase the capacity. That's something that the Corps has indicated they're open to. We had a meeting earlier. I don't think there'd be huge environmental hurdles or whatever. That could keep boaters on the lake for a longer period of time. And help us through at least a lot of the tough years. Not all the tough years, not just the real world, but at least a lot of the tough years. I think from a business standpoint, for the businessmen and women here, it was brought up again at a previous meeting, we alluded to it here, that if there's as much information you should get from the Corps about what they're planning in terms of maintenance, conservation, new laws that they or Cameron or I or Sam or whoever is worried about affecting your business, and we're going to be addressing that in year 2016, 2017, 2018, we're going to try to, then at least it gives you an opportunity to plan accordingly a little bit. Know when to spend money to make an investment or when to hold it back. We also, at an earlier meeting, didn't come up here, I'd like to get a little more information on, there's a buffer that the Corps talked about that, I don't know if it's a lot of water, but something that is been historically held back for agricultural uses, or trying to get feedback from our friends and partners that are agricultural users on this, but there may be a little wiggle room. Again, in bad years, maybe not horrific years, but in bad years, we could talk to our partners and see if we could use a little bit of that money. So I think and then maybe look at, is there wiggle room at the top of the dam? I need to get more information from Justin and the rest of the guys to do that. So that's what I'm thinking. The big thing for you guys would be to maybe get with the marine owners and support this, at least the short-term solution, and we'll work together with our partners on some of the longer-range solutions.
So I got one last question.
Kevin, you mentioned dredging is one of the resiliency strategies. Are there others?
I'm not going to say what I think is resiliency. You have a resiliency strategy? Oh, okay. I don't know. That's the one that we talked about, was just trying to get the marinas to be able to float longer. We went over to Sportsman's today, and And I thought, well, they just can just let their marinas out. Well, they've got too steep of a shelf, so maybe theirs is leveling that shelf. I mean, there's all, I just know how many of us have here gone to Shasta or Lake Powell or someplace like that. And you know, that Lake Powell's 80 feet below where it was the first time I went there. And they've got systems set up where they can keep those docks going. We're not Lake Powell, but there's a way to set up systems that docks can go longer or be in the water earlier, et cetera, extend the season on either end. That's what we're talking about. So anything we have not talked about, and then we'll all hang around. Yeah, the guy with his hands up waving me down.
I just want to get this question because I think a lot of people want the same answer. You said there is in a drought year, you can hold a little bit more back. Since we had a drought last year, was this year held, did we hold a little bit more back at the beginning of the year, and we use it as an average year on the books?
So in terms of holding it back, what I said earlier is in years where we have drier than normal conditions, that group of folks that make water management decisions that help us know what those impacts are, we shape those flows, those minimum tributary flows, and it helps us retain water in the reservoir longer. 2015, we weren't going to fill, we weren't going to get close to filling, but there was an awful lot of behind-the-scenes discussion on how to store and retain as much water so that we could do the best we could for downstream interests and keep water in the reservoir. That's true in a year like this as well. There are limitations, though. You know, the question is, well, can you go down to 750 CFS? There are significant impacts downstream when that happens. And so when I talk about modifications to outflow, you saw an earlier than normal reduction to 1,000 CFS, that retention of water. That makeup water, that 50 CFS that you see that's tacked onto that 1,000 CFS minimum normally at this time of year. That was another negotiated concession that we held some additional water back. That stored water a little longer in the reservoir. It also prolonged temperature operations. So those are the kinds of adjustments in here that we make that help us retain water longer, and that's done in consultation with all of those other interests.
I do have
Great, thank you.
Question. Several people have asked me about the minimum water flows. Why do we have to say at 1,500? Why do we have to say at 1,000? Even though there's only 600 coming in, and that's what you would naturally have gotten if the dam wasn't there. Why don't they control down?
All right, Chris. You want to try to do that in a succinct way?
Yeah, it's tough. We could spend all evening talking about this, and obviously.
Can you speak up?
Yeah.
Maybe come up here and turn around so everybody can hear you.
Or you can use a...
Did you hear the question back there?
Yeah.
Repeat the question and then...
So the question is why we have those tributary flows, why they look like what they do, why they're shaped the way they are, timing is in the year, etc.
So you had 600 coming in, but you got to let out 1,500, and then if the dam wasn't there, all you'd have was 600 for the fish.
Right, and so we have, and Dustin alluded to this, what's called the biological opinion. It's a set of actions that we're required to take to comply with the Endangered Species Act. And in your basin, you have two fish that are present that are listed under that Endangered Species Act. One is the upper Willamette spring chinook, the other is the upper Willamette winter steelhead. And so we went through a long process to work out that biological opinion. In fact, it took about 8 years. The culmination of that was the buyout, and a big part of that was a set of targets for the main stem and tributaries. And those were negotiated. They're meant to try to support downstream fish life. Things like steelhead spawning out here just below gates and below the dams itself. And so we negotiated that. We do the best we could. Those steelhead are confined to the area below Detroit Dam right now. That's about 30% of their historic range. So they're trying to make a living with about 30% of what they did historically. Now, there's long-term plans to put those fish above the dam and expand their range and hopefully their numbers. As their numbers come up, then we have opportunity to look at some of those other things. But those flows, and we've gone out and done a lot of evaluation on the ground of how those flows work in terms of supporting spawning. And we've been able to say that what got put in place does work. Does that mean it's going to be that way forever? No, I don't think so. And we're constantly evaluating whether we can make changes to those flows and how we might be able to.
But tell them there is an end date where you're going to reevaluate. It's in 2021.
So the buyout has a 15-year time frame. It's 2023 in this case. Presumably that won't be the.
So at the risk of hijacking the next Detroit Lakes Committee meeting, was going to propose today at the end that we come back at the next meeting and talk in more detail about the buyout, both in terms of where we are now and the types of changes to the infrastructure that are coming in the future. And we can do that at the next meeting, we can do that at the one after, whatever works best.
Great. Good question, Scott. So I just want to say thank you to everybody. It's 8 o'clock. There is somebody in the back of the room I wanted to introduce. The commissioners added a deputy this year that's specifically dedicated to the Santiam Canyon because we know we needed more law enforcement up here. I don't want to get into the details, but we lost three federal contracts that we used to have deputies up here patrolling all the time. But Mark, you want to raise your hand back there? You will see Mark around. If you haven't met him already, if he hasn't given you a citation, he's meeting with neighbors. He will be, this summer he's been working the little North Fork a lot because last year we had a lot of problems up there, but I ran into him. In fact, he gave me a lesson on how to put I was driving my golf cart and he said, no, you got it. How's my hand go out? Like this? I'll teach you. Yeah, he'll teach me. He's teaching me how to drive my golf cart around Detroit. So Mark, thank you for being here. And Under Sheriff Troy Clausen is back in the room too. We thank the Marion County Sheriff's Department for all the support they give us and the good work that our law enforcement officers do. So thank you for being here tonight, and I'll see you on the lake this weekend.